welcome to the deep dive. I mean, today we have a really incredible document on the table.
You really do.
It's simply titled 34.anagami.pdf.
Just a very unassuming file name for what it actually is.
Right, exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is to decode what this source claims is, well, an objective, observable state of human evolution.
Which is a massive claim to make right out of the gate.
It really is. Specifically, we're looking at the third grade of enlightenment. And we're going to see how this ancient concept maps perfectly across Buddhist mechanics, medieval alchemy, and, even modern cognitive psychology.
It's a remarkable synthesis because the source material, it doesn't just present an ancient doctrine in a vacuum.
Yeah. No, not at all.
It uses a very specific Buddhist framework as a lens to describe what it calls a real phenomenon.
Right.
An objective state of human consciousness that has been independently documented by, well, various traditions throughout history.
Yeah, and we're going to be looking at the text itself, which unpacks the mechanics of a state called the Anāgāmī.
Or the non-returner.
The non-returner, yes. But we also have these two really striking visual diagrams. They combine spiritual, organic, and celestial imagery.
Plus, a comprehensive study guide that ties all these themes together for us.
Yeah, the study guide is super helpful. And to give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about, consider this core question.
Okay, lay it out.
What happens to a human being when they completely lose the biological and psychological capacity for ill will and sensory attachment, but they choose to remain deeply engaged in the material world?
It sounds like a paradox, honestly.
It does. We're talking about the concept of becoming what the text refers to as a karmic dampener.
A karmic dampener.
Yeah. Imagine a human being who literally absorbs and neutralizes the negativity of a community just by their very structural nature.
Just by existing in that space.
Exactly. It's a massive claim, and we're going to scrutinize it from every single angle.
Well, to really understand the mechanics of how a person reaches that state, we need to start with the visual framework the author provides.
The diagrams.
Right. The text operates under the assumption that a picture is worth 1,000 words of, dense theology.
Oh, absolutely.
And the first image in our source material serves as a visual threshold. It illustrates the exact transition point in human development where the internal landscape fundamentally shifts.
Let's paint that picture for you, the listeners, so you can see what we're looking at.
Go for it.
So the first image centers on a single figure. It's a person, their eyes are gently closed, and they're standing with an incredibly straight posture.
Very grounded.
Very grounded, yeah. They're wearing a simple flowing robe, and their hands are cupped right at the center of their torso.
Right around the solar plexus.
Yeah, exactly. And they're cradling this perfect, glowing sphere. It almost looks like they're holding a miniature luminous moon.
Keep that moon imagery in mind.
Oh, definitely. We'll get back to that. But the most vital detail is the actual environment they're in.
The background is doing a lot of heavy lifting here.
It really is. This figure is standing squarely on a boundary line between two completely irreconcilable realms.
The juxtaposition is just stark. And it represents the fundamental tension of the human mind.
Right. So on the left side of the figure, the background is this dark, chaotic, suffocating mass.
It looks almost subterranean.
Yeah, like a dense thicket of tangled roots, thick, thorny vines, and jagged textures. They're just weaving in and out of each other without any discernible pattern.
It feels very heavy, very organic and messy.
Exactly. But then on the right side of the figure, the environment snaps into complete order.
It's a total contrast.
It's a bright, luminous space. You see these perfect geometric lines, astronomical charts mapping constellations, and smooth, flawless spheres floating in orbit.
Along delicate, very precise pathways.
It's the absolute epitome of cosmic clarity. And right at the bottom center, emanating from where the figure's feet rest, there are concentric ripples spreading out across the floor.
Like a single drop of water hitting a perfectly still pond.
Yes, and there's a vertical pillar of light rising up right through the figure.
This image is just the ultimate metaphor for the Anagami threshold. Notice that the figure isn't turned away from the dark, tangled roots on the left.
Right, they aren't facing the light side exclusively.
No, nor are they fleeing into the bright, ordered geometry on the right. They're standing perfectly still, right on the boundary.
They've become the stabilized center.
Exactly. The tangled roots represent what the text calls the gross fetters.
The gross fetters, okay.
Yeah, the sensory entanglements of the earthly realm, the constant, exhausting pushing and pulling of human emotion.
Which we all know very well.
Right. And the right side represents the detachment and the macro-level order of an awakened mind.
So the Anagami holds the space between them.
They master the chaos without needing to escape it entirely.
That makes a lot of sense. The text actually pairs this image with a quote from a foundational Buddhist text, the Samyutta Nikaya, specifically section 12.70. And for some context for you, the Samyutta Nikaya is a massive collection of linked discourses attributed to the Buddha, dealing heavily with the mechanics of the mind.
It's a very technical text.
It is. The quote reads, "An Anagami has completely eradicated the first 5 fetters, including sensual desire and ill will. After death, an Anagami is reborn in the pure abodes where they attain final nibbana without returning to the human realm."
And it continues.
He goes on to say, "With the abandoning of pleasure and pain, he enters and dwells in the 4th jhana. If he is one who does not return, he makes an end of suffering in that very state."
There's a lot of highly specific terminology in that passage that we really need to define.
Definitely. Where should we start?
Let's start with the 4th jhana. In this framework, a jhana isn't just a fleeting moment of calm you might get from, a meditation app.
Like taking 5 deep breaths before a meeting.
Right, it's not that. It is a profound, incredibly stable state of meditative absorption. By the time someone reaches the 4th jhana, the mental static of the brain essentially flatlines.
The quote notes, it requires the abandoning of pleasure and pain.
Yes, it is a state of pure, bright equanimity.
And reaching that state is tied directly to these first 5 fetters. The quote specifically highlights 2 of them for us, sensual desire and ill will.
The heavy hitters.
But what are the first 3? If we're talking about a sequential process of untangling those dark roots from the image, what has this person already cleared out before they even tackle desire and ill will?
Well, in the Buddhist psychological model that the author is using here, fetters are the mental chains that bind a consciousness to the cycle of suffering and conditioned responses.
Okay, mental chains.
Right. The first 3 fetters, which are eradicated in earlier stages of development, are first, the illusion of a separate permanent self.
Meaning the ego.
Essentially, yes. Second is debilitating doubt in the mechanics of reality.
Like doubting the process itself.
Exactly. And third is attachment to ascetic rules and rituals.
Which means what, exactly?
It means the belief that simply going through the motions of a religious practice will somehow save you. Believing that if you just light the right incense or say the right chant, that's enough.
I see. So an individual clears those 3 out. They see through the illusion of a rigid ego, they understand how their mind works, and they drop the superficial rituals.
Yes.
But then they are left with the 4th and 5th fetters, sensual desire and ill will.
And those are the fundamental biological drives.
And the text tells us that the Anagami has completely eradicated these.
Completely.
Not managed, not suppressed.
Yeah.
Eradicated.
That is the pivotal distinction of this specific grade of enlightenment. By permanently cutting away those 2 gross fetters, they unbind themselves from the earthly sensory realm entirely.
The quote mentions they are reborn in the pure abodes.
Right, which our text later refers to as a fairly exclusive region of the mental heavens to attain final realization without ever returning to the human realm.
Hence, the literal translation of Anagami.
The non-returner.
The non-returner, which transitions us to the second image provided in the source material.
Another fascinating diagram.
Yes. If the first image showed the Anagami standing as a bridge between chaos and order, the second image zeroes in on the actual mechanics of that transformation.
The process itself.
Right. It's a circular, mandala-like design. And at the very top center, there is a prominent, glowing crescent moon.
It's a very striking focal point.
It's surrounded by delicate orbital rings, almost like a miniature solar system, but centered entirely around lunar energy rather than solar energy.
Keep that lunar symbolism in mind as the author leans heavily into it when we bridge over to the alchemical texts a bit later.
So you have this moon at the top, radiating a soft, cool light downward. The bottom half of the circle is filled with what looks like raw, jagged crystals.
Or rough rocks jutting up from the ground.
Yeah. They're unrefined, chaotic, and sharp. But as your eye moves upward through the mandala, following the energy flow, those rough crystals begin to break apart and levitate.
They start floating up.
And as they rise toward the moon, they transform. They literally shift their shape from irregular, jagged rocks into perfect, glowing, geometric forms.
Intricate polyhedrons, specifically dodecahedrons.
They become luminous and mathematically ordered. It is a literal visual depiction of transmutation.
And the text the author pairs with the second image is fascinating because it abandons the Buddhist framework entirely here.
It's a completely different source.
Right. The quote is from the Gospel of Thomas, saying 22, which is a Christian mystic text.
And what does it say?
It reads, when you make the two one, and when you make the inner as the outer and the outer as the inner, then shall you enter the kingdom.
What a deliberate choice by the author. We have an image rooted in geometry and what looks like alchemical transmutation, paired with a quote from an apocryphal Christian text, which is being used to elaborate on a Buddhist concept of a non-returner.
It is a deliberate stacking of traditions. The author states right at the beginning, well, this is a Buddhist term. One assumes they describe a real phenomenon through the lens of Buddhism.
So they're saying the label doesn't matter as much as the experience.
Exactly. By pulling from these disparate sources, the text is pointing a spotlight at a universal human threshold. The transformation of the rough crystals into perfect geometry is the visual equivalent of making the inner as the outer.
I see.
The raw, unrefined emotional reactions of a human being, the jagged rocks of ill will and sensory craving, are transmuted by the light of awareness into a perfect, structured, harmonious state of being.
The inner chaos is resolved.
And therefore the outer world reflects that peace.
Let's dig into the actual architecture of how this mind functions on a daily basis.
Let's do it.
The text explicitly tells us that the Anagami represents the third grade of enlightenment. According to the study guide's integration points, this follows a previous, less advanced stage called the Sakadami.
Or the once-returner.
But at this third stage, the mechanics of the mind undergo a permanent structural alteration. The text states that the mind of the Anagami no longer clings to sensory experience, nor will ill will arise spontaneously.
The phrasing here demands incredibly close attention.
How so?
No longer clings, and nor will ill will arise spontaneously. For the average person, consciousness is a reactive loop.
Stimulus and response.
Exactly. You encounter a stimulus, a sight, a sound, a social interaction, and a biological grasping occurs. You want more of it, or you want it to go away.
That is sensory attachment.
Right. If you encounter an obstacle or an insult, anger bubbles up instantly. That is spontaneous ill will.
Let's ground this in a modern reality for you listening. Consider the amount of mental energy an average person expends just arguing with strangers on the internet.
Oh, a massive amount.
Or stewing over an annoying habit of a coworker. For almost all of us, a biological mechanism instantly fires when we perceive a slight.
Adrenaline surges.
Cortisol floods the system, and a flare of anger, ill will arises completely spontaneously. You didn't rationally decide to be angry.
No, the anger was an involuntary reflex.
So is the text suggesting that the Anagami still feels that spike of cortisol, but just uses masterful stoicism to not act on it?
No, it is suggesting something much more radical.
Really?
It's not that the Anagami feels the anger and then uses mindfulness to suppress it. That kind of active suppression is characteristic of the earlier stages of spiritual practice.
Where you're still fighting your own mind.
Exactly. The Anagami has actually rewritten their cognitive baseline so that the spark of ill will cannot even ignite.
It can't ignite.
The foundational psychological structure that produces the anger reflex has been dismantled entirely. The text says, at a fundamental level, the mind of the Anagami will never cling enough to sensory-based desire or ill will to permit rebirth in the sensory realm.
The fuel is simply gone.
Completely gone.
The text describes attachment to sensory phenomena and ill will as tiresome distractions.
That phrasing is so telling.
It really is. It frames these profound human struggles not as moral failures or profound sins, but just as cognitive inefficiencies.
They are a massive drain on your battery.
Imagine the sheer volume of cognitive bandwidth that would be freed up if the tiresome distractions of sensory attachment and spontaneous anger were entirely deleted from your operating system.
It would be staggering.
If you weren't constantly desiring what you don't have, or being irritated by what you do have, what would you actually do with all that surplus mental energy?
According to the text, when that massive amount of psychological energy is no longer being consumed by the self's constant demands for pleasure and avoidance of pain, it naturally redirects outward.
Outward toward others.
Yes. Having made a resolve to refrain from such mental states, the Anagami tends to become both benevolent and healing.
But before we explore the practical mechanics of that healing, the author takes us on an extended detour into medieval alchemy to explain the exact nature of this transformed consciousness.
Right, they switch paradigms again.
The text notes that the Anagami stage is the precise equivalent of what alchemists documented as Albedo.
Or the whitening of the stone.
The whitening of the stone.
Yeah.
So to decipher this, we have to understand what the alchemists were actually doing.
Because it wasn't just early chemistry.
In esoteric alchemical tradition, The stone, the philosopher's stone, is not a literal physical rock they were trying to cook in a laboratory.
The text explicitly states, the stone represents the subjective reality of the alchemist.
It is a metaphor for the alchemist's own consciousness, their internal experience of the universe.
And the text says this subjective reality has deviated from normal fate and now has mastered sensory-based karma.
That phrase, deviated from normal fate, implies that what we consider human nature is essentially deterministic.
We are bound by our programming.
Normal fate is being a biological machine pushed around by stimulus and response. If someone insults you, you get mad. If you see something beautiful, you want to own it.
That's a predictable script.
Very predictable. To deviate from normal fate means you have broken the script. You are no longer bound by the predictable outcomes of cause and effect that govern the sensory realm.
And this mastery is symbolized by the stage of Albedo. Alchemy charts human development in color stages.
Right.
It begins with the Nigredo, or the blackening.
The dark night of the soul.
Exactly. This is the burning away of the ego, the confrontation with the shadow. Psychologically, that corresponds to the tangled, dark roots in our first image.
It is agonizing work.
But following the Nigredo is the Albedo, the whitening. It is a stage of purification, profound clarity, and emotional washing.
The text highlights a very specific alleged property of this stage. It says, in alchemy, we learn that at the state of whiteness, the stone is capable of turning base metals into silver.
Turning base metals into silver.
And the text makes sure we don't miss the celestial symbolism here. It says, silver, in alchemy, is a reference to the moon. The moon creates cycles, evident both astrologically and biologically. It is the lesser light of the firmament.
This brings us right back to the second image. The glowing crescent moon presiding over the transformation of the rough crystals.
The crystals turning to silver.
Yes. In Hermetic traditions, the sun represents the absolute unconditioned truth, the final blinding goal of ultimate enlightenment. But the moon is the lesser light. It doesn't generate its own blinding fire. It reflects the sun's light into the darkness of the night.
It is gentle, cool, and it guides travelers without overwhelming them.
That is a beautiful analogy for how this person operates in society.
It really is. They aren't blinding people with ultimate incomprehensible truths about the void or the nature of absolute reality.
No, they are providing a soft, reflective, navigating light in the darkness of the sensory world.
They have purified their base metals, their raw, primitive, reactive emotional states, into silver, a clear, reflective, lunar consciousness that restores harmony to whatever environment they are in.
The author draws this conclusion explicitly. So the stone, or subjective reality of the alchemist at Albedo, is one that restores harmony and balance.
It heals.
It heals. And this brings us to what is perhaps the most crucial and counterintuitive mechanic described in the entire source document.
Which is how exactly this lunar consciousness actually heals people. This is where we get into the practical application of the text. The author states that Anāgāmis become natural healers who are eager to settle the troubled minds of others.
But there is a massive caveat to how this healing works.
A huge caveat. It runs completely counter to the Western interventionist model of helping people.
Exactly. When we think of healing or helping, we usually envision an active, forceful process. You give advice, you physically intervene, you project positive energy, you try to actively fix the broken thing.
But the text makes a crucial distinction. It says, it heals not through any positive influence, but more through an elimination of what causes imbalance.
Let me repeat that because it requires a complete paradigm shift.
Please do.
It heals not through any positive influence, but through an elimination of what causes imbalance. The study guide defines this as the concept of karmic dampening.
The text says, they tend to absorb unwholesome karma directed at them through wisdom, compassion, and understanding, whilst themselves being natural beacons of wisdom and calmness.
Let's analyze the psychological physics of this.
The physics of karmic dampening.
Right. The study guide highlights karmic dampening as a core concept, defining it as the process of absorbing and neutralizing unwholesome karma.
How do they mechanically do this?
The text gives us the key. They are no longer operating out of a sense of selfness.
Meaning the ego construct is entirely absent.
Precisely. Think about a standard conflict. Someone comes at you with anger, blame, or toxic energy.
That is unwholesome karma in motion.
In a normal interaction, your sense of self, your ego, feels attacked. It immediately hardens to protect itself.
It becomes a rigid wall.
And what happens when a forceful energy hits a rigid wall?
It bounces back.
You react. You throw a defense or a counterattack back at the person. The karma ricochets, multiplies, and the situation escalates into a cycle of suffering.
I see what the text is pointing at here.
Mm-hmm.
If the ego is a wall, the karma bounces.
Yes.
So the Anagami hasn't simply built a stronger, more resilient wall. They've removed the wall entirely. They become an acoustic dampener for the social environment.
That is exactly the mechanic. There is no wall of selfness for the anger to strike.
Wow.
When unwholesome karma is directed at them, it enters their field, and instead of hitting an ego and bouncing back, it is absorbed by their wisdom, compassion, and understanding.
It sinks into the void of their equanimity and simply dissipates.
They neutralize the negative charge by refusing to provide a surface for it to reflect off of.
Think about the psychological equivalent of this in a mundane setting. Have you ever been furious at someone, ready for a massive fight, and when you confronted them, they didn't defend themselves, they didn't attack back, and they didn't get defensive?
They just listened.
Completely unbothered but deeply attentive, and held the space. It is incredibly disarming.
It really is.
Almost always, your anger burns itself out remarkably fast because it has no fuel to feed on. Now, extrapolate that momentary social dynamic to a permanent, effortless state of being.
That is the Anagami acting as an environmental filter for their social ecosystem.
It's a profound practical application, as the study guide calls it. Natural healing through wisdom and compassion and restoration of balance in communities.
They aren't necessarily performing overt miracles or running around aggressively fixing people's problems.
Right.
Their very psychological structure inherently settles the troubled minds of anyone they interact with.
So if this person acts as a passive karmic shock absorber, it begs a very practical question.
What's that?
What does their day-to-day actually look like? Are they just meditating in a cave, completely detached from the world?
That's a common assumption.
The assumption is often that the more spiritually evolved you are, the more removed from worldly responsibilities you must be.
The author explicitly addresses this and shatters that misconception entirely.
Oh, good.
The study guide lists relationship between spiritual and material life and substantive. How does detachment influence worldly responsibilities as key reflection questions?
And in the alchemical framework, the author notes, this phase corresponds to the stage of multiplication.
And multiplication is defined in the text as an integration between the personal, often solitary existence of the once hermit with their social environment.
The text makes a surprising observation here. It states, generally at this stage, the material life of the Anagami is approximating their spiritual life.
They are mirroring each other perfectly.
And here is a detail from the text that really challenged my preconceptions. It says, things make sense, and their understanding of karma tends to create relative success and fortune.
Success and fortune.
Success and fortune. That feels almost taboo to say in the context of deep spiritual enlightenment. We are conditioned to think of enlightened beings as impoverished ascetics.
It does feel contradictory at first glance, but if you follow the strict logic of the text, it is the only outcome that makes sense.
Walk me through that logic.
Why do people usually fail or create chaos and ruin in their material lives, their businesses, or their families?
Usually it's because of their gross fetters. They make terrible, short-sighted decisions driven by greed or sensual desire.
They destroy valuable professional or personal relationships because of spontaneous ill will, pride, and anger.
They are unreliable because they are constantly distracted by chasing what they want versus dealing with the reality of what is.
In short, they are constantly self-sabotaging.
Precisely. Now, take an individual who has eradicated all of those internal saboteurs. They see the mechanics of cause and effect, karma, with absolute clarity.
They aren't clouded by their own ego-driven anxieties.
They don't react impulsively to market shifts or interpersonal drama.
Right.
They naturally restore balance to the teams or families they are a part of.
Of course, that person is going to experience relative success and fortune in the material world.
They have become flawlessly effective operators in the sensory realm, precisely because they are no longer enslaved by it.
It's the ultimate paradox. By completely detaching from the desperate biological need for sensory success, they become perfectly optimized to achieve it naturally.
The text points out, some are more than content supporting a family or community with their wisdom and providence.
And further, such an individual has found deep peace and will find genuine enjoyment in helping others face the challenges of life.
They find genuine enjoyment in it. They aren't white-knuckling their way through family dinners or board meetings out of a heavy sense of spiritual obligation.
This circles back perfectly to the quote from the Gospel of Thomas that we discussed with the second image.
When you make the inner as the outer and the outer as the inner.
At the multiplication stage, the profound, unshakable peace of their inner world multiplies and manifests as order, stability, and prosperity in their outer world.
They become the pillars of their communities.
They are the fixed, stable center that the first visual diagram depicted.
So we have this picture of absolute earthly optimization. You have total inner peace. Your brain no longer generates anger or frantic craving.
You are a natural healer who dampens the chaos of everyone around you.
And your material life is successful and harmonious because you clearly understand cause and effect. It sounds like the perfect ending to the human story.
But our text presents us with an ultimate, final crossroad.
Yes. For many, as the text states, this is the ceiling of their earthly journey.
And it is a magnificent ceiling. The author notes, there really is no need to seek further unless one is driven by a greater goal.
The text tells us that the Anagami will, upon earthly death, be reborn in those pure abodes to achieve final realization. They don't come back to the messy human realm, they graduate.
It is a state of profound, ultimate contentment.
However, the text introduces a vital caveat here. It says, however, if they wish to pursue the path, this is when the real inner work is set to begin.
The real inner work.
Wait, the real inner work. That is a staggering statement considering everything we've just discussed.
Eradicating all sensory desire and the biological capacity for ill will was apparently just the prologue.
What could possibly be left to do?
This is where we look at the integration points in the study guide. It links this stage as the foundation for Arahant and notes links to subtle fetters.
The Anagami has eradicated the gross fetters, the heavy chains.
But the Buddhist framework dictates that there are 5 subtler fetters remaining.
Like what?
These include things like a subtle desire for existence in formless, purely mental realms, a lingering, whisper-thin sense of conceit, or a very subtle restlessness.
The ultimate microscopic final layers of the ego in you.
Exactly. The text suggests that even in the state of supreme balance, something else might happen.
What's that?
There might arise at some later time, maybe even shortly before the physical death of the Anagami, a certain restlessness with the status quo, and once again they might look deeper into conditioned reality.
Why would someone who has achieved total peace and relative success become restless?
Because the Anagami, with their immense clarity, eventually sees that even this beautiful, peaceful, lunar state of Albedo is still a conditioned reality.
It still depends on causes and conditions.
It's still a state that depends on certain factors. It is not the absolute, unconditioned ground state of reality.
And for a rare few, the drive for absolute, unconditioned truth, the final goal, the stage of the Arahant, pushes them to deconstruct even this perfect peace.
They have to leave the gentle silver of the moon and aim for the blinding gold of the sun, to use the alchemical metaphor.
They have to give up being the perfect human in order to transcend the concept of being human entirely.
It is a staggering philosophical choice. It represents the tension between the desire to serve and be in the world.
To be the karmic dampener for your family and community.
And the ultimate ascetic drive for absolute unconditional liberation.
The text beautifully summarizes this tension at the very end. Their path illuminates the possibility of transcending earthly attachments while remaining deeply engaged in the healing of the world, much like the moon's gentle light that guides travelers through darkness.
It's a very poetic conclusion.
What an incredible journey this document takes us on, just to synthesize and recap where we've been.
We started with the visual threshold.
The Anagami, standing as the stabilized center between the dark, tangled vines of sensory chaos and the luminous spheres of cosmic order.
We unpack the architecture of this mind, exploring what it literally means to rewrite your cognitive baseline, to eradicate the gross fetters of desire and spontaneous ill will.
We look through the alchemical mirror, seeing how the whitening phase of Albedo transforms the raw, base metals of human reaction into the clear silver light of lunar consciousness.
We discuss the mechanics of karmic dampening, how eliminating the selfness removes the wall that negative karma bounces off of, turning the individual into a natural shock absorber for their community.
And we saw how this spiritual mastery multiplies into material integration, bringing relative success and fortune before finally arriving at the ultimate choice between the ceiling of earthly contentment and the final push toward deconstructing conditioned reality entirely.
It is a profound roadmap, and there is one final unstated implication in all of this that is worth mulling over.
Let's hear it.
The text describes the Anagami as a karmic dampener who absorbs unwholesome karma to heal others. If this is true, if this is an objective, observable phenomenon, as the author suggests, it implies something massive about the nature of our reality.
What does it imply?
It suggests that human consciousness is not just a private, isolated experience happening inside the dark theater of your own skull.
It's not just locked in our heads.
No. It suggests that consciousness is an active, invisible physics engine playing out in the physical space between us. A shared ecosystem of cause and effect.
That is fascinating.
And if that is the case, it means that your personal inner peace, your work to clear your own tangled roots and find your center, is not just a selfish act of self-improvement.
It's much bigger than that.
It is quite literally a public utility. Every ounce of ill will you manage to neutralize within yourself is an ounce of chaos removed from the global system.
Your healing becomes the world's healing.
Precisely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Anagami. Keep asking questions, keep looking for the connections between the inner and outer worlds, and we will catch you next time.